Hello there. How doot? Let me turn that down a little bit. I hope everyone is well. So, we are here. Oh my god, back in my library crypt thing. Yeah. It's a bit dusty. I'm not gonna lie, it's a little bit dusty. We are indeed going to carry on with the Hellbound Heart.
We have such sights to show you.
Thanks very much, Samus. That should have been turned down. What the heck? Oh my god. Yeah, but no, thank you very much for that, dude. Hope you're well. I hope the stream went well. Sorry, I had to bounce off. Said I had a little one appearing. So yeah. I'm actually starting to get a little bit warm. Which isn't good. Maybe if I tie my hair up, it might actually cool down a little bit. It is quite warm here. Hey, Kaz, how's it going, dude? Let's tie it up high today as well, yeah? Let's do that. Like a unicorn. Been doing small things and stuff. Sounds delightful. Delightful indeed. Okay. So, before we get into the nitty-gritty, that is Chapter 5, The Hellbound Heart. Has everybody seen the announcement? Selling some equipment I don't need, painting minis, test printing stuff, and messing around with some stream stuff. Lovely. I actually saw a thing earlier about some 3D printer stuff. They were like some wiggly slugs, and they actually look really cool. Finger extent. They're not the finger extensions. Window capture, that's the one. Whoop. No. It's actually like a slug, and it's just like composed of different parts, like moving slidey parts. So it actually looks like it's moving. Oh, well, that's a bit big. Whoop. Ooh. Put you there. Okay, so first things first. Let's have a look at a thing together. So this was announced yesterday. It was kind of teased that they were going to redo an already existent IP, and Dead Space was top of the list. Turns out that was correct. Look at this. Just actually look at this. Let me just double check that. Yeah, movie and output. Cool. Pause the music for a sec. I love that bit. That looks so good. So good. Okay, so just before we start with chapter 5, let's just have a little bit of a recap. And so Frank, one of two brothers, had purchased a puzzle box which seems to open a dimension, a gateway to another dimension. To which he's supposedly to be shown his innermost desires and the heights of the most greatest pleasures, but it doesn't necessarily mean in the nicest forms. It seems to be ruled by some demons called Cenobites. We have Kirsty, who is the daughter of the other brother, Rory, who seems to be like a bit of a not a typical teenager, we'll say, of the times. I can't remember what the wife's name is actually. Hang on. Let me. Julia. Julia is married to Rory, but she's not in love with Rory. She actually loves his brother, Frank. So it seems. When Rory cut his hand in a room, it turns out that was part of some kind of ritual to bring Frank back from this certain dimension. But now he's craving more blood, and that's where we left off. Frank craving blood while Rory and Julia were getting frisky, we'll say. Anyway, right. So, Chapter 5. Please let me know if the music is too loud. I will rectify it. I have turned redemptions off for tonight as well. There is music? There should be. I can hear it. Good. I'll turn the monitoring off. Cool. It was just super low. Fair enough. Alrighty. Chapter 5. Sometimes it seemed that eons came and went while lingered in the wall. Eons that some clue would later reveal to have been the passing of hours or even minutes. But now things had changed. He had a chance of escape. His spirit soared at the thought. It was a frail chance. He didn't deceive himself about that. There were several reasons his best efforts might falter. Julia, for one. He remembered her as a trite, preening woman whose upbringing had curbed her capacity for passion. He had untamed her, of course, once. He remembered the day among the thousands of times he had performed that act with some satisfaction. She had resisted no more than was needful for her vanity, then succumbed with such naked fervour he had almost lost control himself. In other circumstances he might have snatched her from under her would-be husband's nose, but fraternal politics counselled otherwise. In a week or two he would have tired of her, and been left not only with a woman whose body was already an eyesore to him, but also a vengeful brother on his heels. It hadn't been worth the hassle. Right, there we go.
We'll tear your soul apart.
Crow, thank you very much. Bless you. I'm not entirely sure. It should be. Maybe we'd do that. Wonder if that turns it down. But yeah, no, thank you very much, Crow. Almost a year of naked fervour. Oh. Besides, there'd been new worlds to conquer. He had left the day after to go east, to Hong Kong and Sri Lanka, to wealth and adventure. He'd had them too, at least for a while. But everything slipped through his fingers sooner or later, and with time he began to wonder whether it was circumstance that denied him a good holding on his earnings, or whether he simply didn't care enough to keep what he had. The train of thought once begun was a runaway. Everywhere in the wreckage around him he found evidence to support the same bitter thesis, that he had encountered nothing in his life, no person, no state of mind or body he wanted sufficiently to suffer even passing discomfort for. A downward spiral began. He spent 3 months in a wash of depression and self-pity that bordered on suicidal. But even that solution was denied him by his newfound nihilism. If nothing was worth living for, it followed, didn't it, that there was nothing worth dying for either. He stumbled from one such sterility to the next, until all thoughts were rotted away by whatever opiate his immoralities could earn him. How had he first heard about Lemonshard's box? He couldn't remember. In a bar, maybe, or a gutter. From the lips of a fellow derelict. At the time, it was merely a rumour. This dream of a pleasure dome where those who had exhausted the trivial delights of the human condition might discover a fresh definition of joy. And the route to this paradise? There were several, he was told. Charts of the interface between the real and the realer still, made by travellers whose bones had long since gone to dust. One such chart was in the vaults of the Vatican, hidden in code in a theological work unread since the Reformation. Another, in the form of an origami exercise, was reported to have been in the possession of the Marc de Sade, who used it, while imprisoned in the Bastille, to barter with a guard for paper in which to write the 120 Days of Sodom. Yet another was made by a craftsman, a maker of singing birds called Lemonshard, in the form of a musical box of such elaborate design a man might toy with it half a lifetime and never get inside. Stories. Stories, yet since he had come to believe in nothing at all, it was not so difficult to put the tyranny of verifiable truth out of his head. And it passed the time, musing drunkenly on such fantasies. Rockets, how are you doing, dude? It was in Dusseldorf, where he'd gone smuggling heroin, that he again encountered the story of Lemonshard's box. His curiosity was piqued once more, but this time he followed the story up until he found its source. The man's name was Kirscher, though he probably laid claim to half a dozen others. Yet the German could confirm the existence of the box. And yes, he could see his way to letting Frank have it. Price? Small favours here and there. Nothing exceptional. Frank did the favours, washed his hands and claimed his payment. There had been instructions from Kirscher on how best to break the seal on Lemonshard's device. Instructions that were part pragmatic, part metaphysical. To solve the puzzle is to travel, he'd said, or something like that. The box, it seemed, was not just the map of the road, but the road itself. This new addiction quickly cured him of dope and drink. Perhaps there were other ways to bend the world to suit the shape of his dreams. He came back to the house on Lodovico Street, to the empty house behind whose walls he was now imprisoned, and prepared himself, just as Kirscher had detailed, for the challenge of solving Lemonshard's configuration. I'm sorry to hear that, Rockets. By all means, if you want to talk later on, I'm open ears. He had been arrogant in his dealing with the Order of the Gash. He saw that now, but there were everywhere in the world, and out of it, forces that encourage such arrogance, because they traded on it. That in itself would not have undone him. No, his real error had been the naive belief that his definition of pleasure significantly overlapped with that of the Cenobites. As it was, they had brought incalculable suffering. He had overdosed him on sensuality until his mind teetered on madness. Then they initiated him into experiences that his nerves still convulsed to recall. They had called it pleasure, and perhaps they'd meant it, perhaps not. It was impossible to know with these minds. They were so hopelessly, flawlessly ambiguous. They recognized no principles of reward and punishment by which he could hope to win some respite from their torture. nor were they touched by any appeal for mercy. He'd tried that over the weeks and months that separated the solving of the box from today. There was no compassion to be had on this side of the schism. There was only the weeping and the laughter, tears of joy sometimes, for an hour without dread, a breath's length even. Laughter coming just as paradoxically in the face of some new horror, fashioned by the engineer for the provision of grief. There was a further sophistication to the torture, devised by a mind that understood exquisitely the nature of suffering. The prisoners were allowed to see into the world they had once occupied. Their resting places, when they were not enduring pleasure, looked out onto the very locations where they had once worked the configuration that had brought them here. In Frank's case, onto the upper room of number 55 Ludovico Street. For the best part of a year, it had been an illuminating view. Nobody had ever stepped into the house, and then they'd come. Rory and the lovely Julia, and hope had begun again. There were ways to escape. He'd heard it whispered, loopholes in the system that might allow a mind supple or cunning enough egress into the room from which it had come. Hey, Crazy, how's it going, buddy? If a prisoner were able to make such an escape, there was no way that the Hierophants could follow. They had to be summoned across the schism. Without such an invitation, they were left like dogs on the doorstep, scratching and scratching, but unable to get in. Escape, therefore, if it could be achieved, brought with it a decree of absolute, total dissolution of the mistaken marriage which the prisoner had made. It was a risk worth taking. Indeed, it was no risk at all. What punishment could be meted out worse than the thought of pain without hope of release? He had been lucky. Some prisoners had departed from the world without leaving sufficient sign of themselves from which, given an adequate collision of circumstances, their bodies might be remade. He had. Almost his last act, bar the shouting, had been to empty his testicles onto the floor. Dead sperm was a meagre keepsake of his essential self, but enough. When dear brother Rory, sweet butterfingered Rory, had let his chisel slip, there was something of Frank to profit from the pain. He had found a fingerhold for himself, and a glimpse of strength with which he might haul himself to safety. Now it was up to Julia. Sometimes, suffering in the wall, he thought she would desert him out of fear. Either that, or she'd rationalise the vision she'd seen and decide she'd been dreaming. If so, he was lost. He lacked the energy to repeat the appearance. But there were signs that gave him cause for hope. The fact that she returned to the room on 2 or 3 occasions, for instance, and simply stood in the gloom watching the wall. She'd even muttered a few words on the second visit, though he had only caught scraps. The word "here" was among them, and "waiting" and "soon." Enough to keep him from despair. He had another prop to his optimism. She was lost, wasn't she? He'd seen that in her face, when before the day Rory had chiselled himself, she and his brother had had occasion to be in the room together. He'd read the looks between the lines, the moments when her guard had slipped, and the sadness and frustration she felt were apparent. Yes, she was lost. Married to a man she felt no love for, and unable to see a way out. Well, here he was. They could save each other, the way the poets promised lovers should. He was mystery, he was darkness. He was all she had dreamed of. and if she would only free him, he would service her. Oh yes, until her pleasure reached that threshold that, like all thresholds, was a place where the strong grew stronger and the weak perished. Pleasure was pain there, and vice versa, and he knew it well enough to call home. Chapter 6. It turned cold in the third week of September, an Arctic chill brought on by a rapacious wind that stripped the trees of leaves in a handful of days. The cold necessitated a change of costume, a change of plan. Instead of walking, Julia took the car, drove down to the city centre in the early afternoon and found a bar in which the lunchtime trade was brisk but not clamorous. The customers came and went, young Turks from firms of lawyers and accountants, debating their ambitions, parties of wine imbibers whose only claim to sobriety was their suits, and more interestingly, a smattering of individuals who sat alone at their tables and simply drank. She garnered a good crop of admiring glances, but they were mostly from the young Turks. It wasn't until she'd been in the place an hour, and the wage slaves were returning to their treadmills, that she caught sight of somebody watching her reflection in the bar mirror. For the next 10 minutes his eyes were glued to her. She went on drinking, trying to conceal any sign of agitation, and then, without warning, he stood up and crossed to her table. "Drinking alone," he said. She wanted to run. Her heart was pounding so furiously, she was certain he must hear it, but no. He asked her if she wanted another drink. She said she did. Clearly pleased not to have been rebuffed, he went to the bar, ordered doubles, and returned to her side. He was ruddy-featured, and one size larger than his dark blue suit. Only his eyes betrayed any sign of nervousness, resting on her for moments only, then darting away like startled fish. There would be no serious conversation. That she had already decided. She didn't want to know much about him. His name, if necessary. His profession and marital status, if he insisted. Beyond that, let him just be a body. As it was there was no danger of a confessional, she'd met more talkative paving stones. He smiled occasionally, a short, nervous smile that showed teeth to be real, and offered more drinks. She said no, wanting the chase over with as soon as possible, and instead asked if he had time for a coffee. He said he had. "The house is only a few minutes from here," she replied, and they went to her car. She kept wondering as she drove the meat on the seat beside her why this was so very easy. Was it that the man was plainly a victim, his ineffectual eyes and his artificial teeth born, did he but know it, to make this journey? Yes, perhaps that was it. She was not afraid, because all of this was perfectly predictable. Excuse me. Have a sippy. Seat meat. Ugh. As she turned the key in the front door and stepped into the house, she thought she heard a noise in the kitchen. Had Rory returned home early? Ill, perhaps? She called out. There was no reply. The house was empty. Almost. From the threshold on, she had the thing planned meticulously. She closed the door. The man in the blue suit stared at his manicured hands and waited for his cue. "I get lonely sometimes," she told him as she brushed past him. It was a line she'd come up with in bed the previous night. He only nodded by way of response, the expression on his face a mingling of fear and incredulity. He clearly couldn't believe his luck. "Do you want another drink?" she asked him, "or shall we go straight upstairs?" He only nodded again. "Which?" "I think maybe I've drunk enough already." "Upstairs, then." He made an indecisive move in her direction, as though he might have intended a kiss. She wanted no courtship, however. Skirting his touch, she crossed the bottom of the stairs. I'll lead," she said, meekly. He followed. At the top of the stairs, she glanced around at him and caught him dabbing sweat from his chin with his handkerchief. She waited until he caught up with her and then led him halfway along the landing to the damp room. The door had been left ajar. "Come on in," she said. He obeyed. Once inside, it took him a few moments to become accustomed to the gloom and a further time to give voice to his observation. "There's no bed." She closed the door and switched on the light. She had hung one of Rory's old jackets on the back of the door in its pocket. She'd left the knife. He said again, "No bed." "What's wrong with the floor?" she replied. "The floor?" "Take off your jacket. You are warm." "I am," he agreed, but did nothing, so she moved across to him and began to slip the knot of his tie. He was trembling. Poor lamb. Poor bleatless lamb. While she removed the tie, he began to shrug off his jacket. Was Frank watching this? She wondered. Her eyes, excuse me, her eyes strayed momentarily to the wall. Yes, she thought, he's there. He sees, he knows. He licks his lips and grows impatient. The lamb spoke. "Why don't you," he began. "Why don't you maybe do the same?" "Would you like to see me naked?" she teased. The words made his eyes gleam. "Yes," he said thickly. "Yes, I'd like that." "Very much." "Very much." He was unbuttoning his shirt. "Maybe you will," she said. He gave her that dwarf smile again. "Is it a game?" he ventured. "If you want it to be," she said, and helped him out of his shirt. His body was pale and waxy, like a fungus. His upper chest was heavy, his belly too. She put her hands to his face. He kissed her fingertips. "You are beautiful," he said, spitting the words out as though they'd been vexing him for hours. "Am I?" "You know you are. Lovely. Loveliest woman I ever set eyes on." "That's gallant of you," she said, and turned back to the door. Behind her, she heard his belt buckle clink, and the sound of cloth slipping over skin as he dropped his trousers. So far and no further, she thought. She had no wish to see him babe naked. It was enough to have him like this. She reached into the jacket pocket. "Oh dear," the lamb suddenly said. She let the knife fly. "What is it?" she asked, turning to look at him. If the ring on his finger hadn't already given his status away, she would have known him to be a married man by the underpants he wore, baggy and overwashed, an unflattering garment bought by a wife who had long since ceased to think of her husband in sexual terms. "I think I need to empty my bladder," he said. "Too many whiskies." She shrugged a small shrug and turned back to the door. "Won't be a moment," he said at her back, but her hand was in the jacket pocket before the words were out, and as he stepped towards the door, she turned on him, slaughtering knife in hand. His pace was too quick to see the blade until the very last moment, and even then it was bemusement that crossed his face, not fear. It was a short-lived look. The knife was in him a moment later. slicing his belly with an ease of a blade in overripe cheese. She opened one cut and then another. The scene takes like 2 minutes in the film. It's nice to hear it from the book. Better pacing. Absolutely, it's very true. As the blood started, she was certain the room flickered, the bricks and mortar trembling to see the spurts that flew from him. She had a breath's length to admire the phenomena. No more before the lamb let out a wheezing curse, and instead of moving out of the knife's range, as she had anticipated, took a step toward her and knocked the weapon from her hand. It spun across the floorboards and collided with the skirting. He was then upon her. He put his hand into her hair and took a fistful. It seemed his intention was not violence but escape, for he relinquished his hold as soon as he pulled away from the door. She fell against the wall, looking up to see him wrestling with the door handle, his free hand clamped to his cuts. She was quick now, across to where the knife lay up, and back toward him in one fluid motion. He had got the door open by inches, but not far enough. She brought the knife down in the middle of his pockmarked back. He yelled and released the door handle. She was already drawing the knife out and plunging into him a second time, and now a third, and a fourth. Indeed, she lost count of the wounds she made her attack lent venom by his refusal to lie down and die. He stumbled around the room, grieving and complaining, blood following blood onto his buttocks and legs. Finally, after an age of this farcical stuff, he keeled over and hit the floor. This time, she was certain her senses did not deceive her. The room, or the spirit in it, responded with soft sighs of anticipation. Hey paper, how's it going, dude? Somewhere, a bell was ringing. Almost an afterthought, she registered that the lamb had stopped breathing. She crossed the blood-spangled floor to where he lay and said, "Enough." Then she went to wash her face. As she moved down the landing, she heard the room groan. There was no other word for it. She stopped in her tracks, almost tempted to go back, but the blood was drying on her hands, and its stickiness revolted her. In the bathroom, she stripped off her flower-patterned blouse and rinsed first her hands, then her speckled arms, and finally her neck. The dousing both chilled and braced her. It felt good. That done, she washed the knife, rinsed the sink, and returned along the landing without bothering to dry herself or to dress. She had no need for either. The room was like a furnace. As the dead man's energies pulsed from his body, they didn't get far. Already the blood on the floor was crawling away toward the wall where Frank was, the beads seeming to boil and evaporate as they came within range of the skirting boards. She watched, entranced. But there was more. Something was happening to the corpse. It was being drained of every nutritious element, the body convulsing as its innards were sucked out, gases moaning in its bowels and throat, the skin desiccating in front of her startled eyes. At one point, the plastic teeth dropped back into the gullet, the gums withered around them. And in mere moments, it was done. Anything the body might have usefully offered by way of nourishment had been taken. The husk that remained would not have sustained a family of fleas. She was impressed. Suddenly, the bulb began to flicker. She looked to the wall, expecting it to tremble and spit her lover from hiding. But no, the bulb went out. There was only the dim light that crept through the age-beaten blind. "Where are you?" she said. The walls remained mute. "Where are you?" Still nothing. The room was cooling. Her breasts had grown goose flesh. She peered down at the luminous watch on the lamb's shriveled arm. It ticked away, indifferent to the apocalypse that had overtaken its owner. It read 4:41. Rory would be back any time after 5:15, depending on how dense the traffic was. She had work to do before then. Bundling up the blue suit and the rest of his clothes, she put them in several plastic bags and then went in search of a larger bag for the remains. She had expected Frank to be here to help her with this labour, but as he hadn't shown, she had no choice but to do it herself. When she came back to the room, the deterioration of the lamb was still continuing, though now much slowed. Perhaps Frank was still finding nutriments to squeeze from the corpse, but she doubted it. More likely, the pauperized body, sucked clean of marrow and every vital fluid, was no longer strong enough to support itself. When she had parcelled it up in the bag, it was the weight of a small child, no more. Sealing the bag up, she was about to take it down to the car when she heard the front door open. The sound undammed all the panic she'd so assiduously kept to herself. She began to shake. Tears pricked her sinuses. Not now, she told herself, but the feelings would simply not be suppressed any longer. In the hallway below, Rory said, "Sweetheart?" Sweetheart. She could have laughed, but for the terror. She was here if he wanted to find her, his sweetheart, his honey bun, with her breasts new washed and a dead man in her arms. "Where are you?" She hesitated before replying, not certain that her larynx was the equal of the deception. He called a third time, his voice changing timbre as he walked through into the kitchen. It would take him a moment only to discover that she wasn't at the cooker stirring sauce. Then he would come back and head up the stairs. She had 10 seconds, 15 at most. Attempting to keep her tread as light as possible, for fear he heard her movements overhead, she carried the bundle to the spare room at the end of the landing, too small to be used as a bedroom, except perhaps for a child. They had used it as a dump. Half-empty tea chests, pieces of furniture they had not found a place for, all manner of rubbish. Here she laid the body to rest a while, behind an upended armchair. Then she locked the door behind her. Just as Rory called from the bottom of the stairs, he was coming up. "Julia? Julia, sweetheart, are you there?" She slipped into the bathroom and consulted the mirror. It showed her a flushed portrait. She picked up the blouse she'd left hanging over the side of the bath and put it on. It smelled stale, and there was undoubtedly blood splattered between the flowers, but she had nothing else to wear. He was coming along the landing. She heard his elephantine tread. "Julia!" This time she answered, making no attempt to disguise the tremulous quality of her voice. The mirror had confirmed what she had feared, that there was no way she could pass herself off as undistressed. She was obliged to make a virtue of the liability. "Are you all right?" he asked. He was outside the door. "No," she said. "I'm feeling sick." "Oh, darling." "I'll be fine in a minute." He tried the handle, but she'd bolted the door. "Can you leave me alone for a little while?" "Do you want a doctor?" "No," she told him. "No, really, but I wouldn't mind a brandy." "Brandy?" "I'll be down in 2 ticks." "Whatever madam wants," he quipped. She counted his steps as he trudged to the stairs, then descended. Once she calculated he was out of earshot, she had slid back the bolt and stepped onto the landing. The late afternoon light was failing quickly. The landing was a murky tunnel. Downstairs she heard the clink of glass on glass. "Randy, that's like 2 steps from me getting Downstairs she heard the clink of glass on glass. She moved as quickly as she dared to Frank's room. There was no sound from the gloomed interior. The walls no longer trembled, nor did distant bells toll. She pushed the door open. It creaked slightly. She had not entirely tidied up after her labours. There was dust on the floor, human dust, and fragments of dried flesh. She went down on her haunches and collected them up diligently. Rory had been right. What a perfect housefrau she made. As she stood up again, something shifted in the ever denser shadows of the room. She looked in the direction of the movement, but before her eyes could make sense of the form in the corner, a voice said, "Don't look at me." It was a tired voice, the voice of somebody used up by events, but it was concrete. The syllables were carried on the same air that she breathed. "Frank," she said. "Yes," came the broken voice. "It's me." From downstairs, Rory called up to her. "Are you feeling better?" She went to the door. "Much better," she responded. At her back, the hidden thing said, "Don't let him near me," the words coming fast and fierce. "It's all right," she whispered to him. Then to Rory, "I'll be with you in a minute. Put on some music, something soothing." Rory replied that he would, and retired to the lounge. I'm only half made," Frank's voice said. "I don't want you to see me. Don't want anybody to see me. Not like this." The words were halting once more and wretched. "I have to have more blood, Julia. More. And soon." "How much more?" she asked the shadows. This time she caught a better glimpse of what lay in wait there. No wonder he wanted no one to look. "Just more," he said. Though the volume was barely above a whisper, there was an urgency in the voice that made her afraid. "I have to go," she said, hearing music from below. This time the darkness made no reply. At the door she turned back. "I'm glad you came," she said, as she closed the door. She heard a sound not unlike laughter behind her, nor unlike sobs. So, Frank is back in the world of the living. But for how long? Is he going to be getting more blood? Who knows? Who knows? Right. I will carry on with chapter 7 shortly, but I do need to use the lavatory. So I would suggest that while I do such a thing, that you go and grab yourself a nice drink, a blanket maybe. Let's chill. We're chilling tonight with horror. Why not? Too many brandies, eh? Oh, I wish. It's too many Vimtos, dude. I don't drink alcohol. Yeah. I'll be back in a moment. I'll leave you with the music and the be right back screen. I'm going to bed soon, so I'm not around when you return. Have a good one, everyone. Take care, Kaz. Have a lovely evening and a restful night's sleep. See you soon. Hello, I have returned. Oh, that was the wrong slider. Oh, the music isn't too loud. I've just readjusted it. Okay. So, we are now on chapter 7. Frank is alive. I suppose that's all that we need to say about that chapter, right? 7. Kirsty, is that you? Yes. Who's this? It's Rory? The line was watery, as though the deluge outside had seeped down the phone. Still, she was happy to hear from him. He called up so seldom, and when he did, it was usually on behalf of both himself and Julia. Not this time, however. This time, Julia was the subject under discussion. There's something wrong with her, Kirsty, he said. I don't know what. Ill, you mean? Maybe. She's just so strange with me, and she looks terrible. Have you said anything to her? She says she's fine, but she isn't. I wondered if maybe she'd spoken with you. I haven't set eyes on her since your housewarming. That's another thing. She doesn't even want to leave the house. It's not like her. Do you want me to have a word with her? Would you? Don't know if it'll do any good, but I'll try. Don't say anything about me talking to you. Of course not. I'll call in at the house tomorrow. Tomorrow. It has to be tomorrow. Yes, I know. I'm afraid I'll lose my grip. I'm afraid I'll lose my grip, Julia. Start slipping back. I'll give you a call from the office on Thursday. You can tell me what you make of her. Slipping back? They'll know I've gone by now. Who will? The gash. The bastards that took me. They're waiting for you? Just beyond the wall. Rory told her how grateful he was, and she in turn told him that it was the least a friend could do. Then he put the phone down, leaving her listening to the rain on the empty line. Then he put down the phone, leaving her listening to the rain on the empty line. Now they were both Julia's creatures, looking after her welfare, fretting for her if she had bad dreams. No matter, it was a kind of togetherness. The man with the white tie had not bided his time. Almost as soon as he set eyes on Julia, he came across to her. She decided, even as he approached, that he was not suitable. Too big, too confident. After the way the first one had fought, she had determined to choose with care, so when White Tie asked her what she was drinking, she told him to leave her be. He was apparently used to rejections and took it in his stride, withdrawing to the bar. She returned to her drink. It was raining heavily today. Had been raining now for 72 hours, on and off, and there were fewer customers than there had been the week before. One or two drowned rats headed in from the street, but none looked her way for more than a few moments, and time was moving on. It was already past 2. She wasn't going to risk getting caught again by Rory's return. She emptied her glass and decided that this was not Frank's lucky day. Then she stepped out of the bar, into the downpour, put up her umbrella and headed back to the car. As she went, she heard footsteps behind her, and then White Tie was at her side saying, My hotel's nearby. Oh, she said, and kept on walking. But he wasn't going to be shrugged off so easily. I'm only here for 2 days, he said. Don't tempt me, she thought. Just looking for some companionship, he went on. I haven't spoken to a soul. Is that right? He took hold of her wrist, a grip so tight she almost cried out. That was when she knew she was going to have to kill him. He seemed to see the desire in her eyes. My hotel, he said. I don't much like hotels. They're so impersonal. Have you got a better idea? He said to her. She had, of course. He hung his dripping raincoat on the hall stand and she offered him a drink, which he welcomed. His name was Patrick, and he was from Newcastle. Down on business, can't seem to get much done. Why's that? He shrugged. I'm probably a bad salesman, simple as that. What do you sell? She asked him. What do you care? He replied, razor quick. She grinned. She would have to get him upstairs quickly before she started to enjoy his company. Why don't we dispense with the small talk, she said. It was a stale line, but it was the first thing that came to her tongue. He swallowed the last of his drink in one gulp and went where she led. This time she had not left the door ajar. It was locked, which plainly intrigued him. After you, he said, when the door swung open. She went first. He followed. This time, she had decided there would be no stripping. If some nourishment was soaked up by his clothes, then so be it. She was not going to give him a chance to realise that they weren't alone in the room. Going to fuck on the floor, are we? He asked casually. Any objections? Not if it suits you, he said, and clamped his mouth over hers, his tongue frisking her teeth for cavities. There was some passion in him, she mused. She could feel him hard against her already, but she had work to do here, blood to spill and a mouth to feed. She broke his kiss and tried to slip from his arms. The knife was back in the jacket on the door. While it was out of reach, she had little power to resist him. What's the problem? He said. No problem, she murmured. There's no hurry either. We've got all the time in the world. She touched the front of his trousers to reassure him, like a stroked dog to close his eyes. You're a strange one, he said. Don't look, she told him. Huh? Keep your eyes closed. He frowned, but obeyed. She took a step backward toward the door, and half turned to fumble in the depths of the pocket, glancing back to see that he was still blind. He was, and unzipping himself. As her hand clasped the knife, the shadows growled. He heard the noise. His eyes sprang open. What was that? He said, reeling around and peering into the darkness. Hey, Slendy, you've wandered into book reading night. We're reading The Hellbound Heart. Currently on chapter 7. What was that? He said, reeling round and peering into the darkness. It was nothing, she insisted, as she pulled the knife from its hiding place. He was moving away from her, across the room. There's somebody. Don't. Here. The last syllable faltered on his lips as he glimpsed a fretful motion in the corner beside the window. What in God's... he began, as he pointed into the darkness. She was at him, and slicing his neck open with a butcher's efficiency. Blood jumped immediately, a fat spurt that hit the wall with a wet thud. She heard Frank's pleasure, and then the dying man's complaint, long and low. His hand went up to his neck to stem the pulse, but she was at him again, slicing his pleading hand, his face. He staggered, he sobbed. Finally, he collapsed, twitching. She stepped away from him to avoid the flailing legs. In the corner of the room, she saw Frank rocking to and fro. Hey Wax, how's it going, dude? Good woman, he said. Was it her imagination, or was his voice already stronger than it had been? More like the voice she'd heard in her head 1,000 times these plundered years. Thank you very much, Crow. The doorbell rang. She froze. Oh, Jesus, her mouth said. It's all right, Shadow replied. He's as good as dead. She looked at the man in the white tie and saw that Frank was right. The twitching had all but ceased. He's big, said Frank, and healthy. He was moving into her sight, too greedy for sustenance to prohibit her stare. She saw him plainly now for the first time. It was a travesty, not just of humanity, of life. She looked away. The doorbell was ringing again, and for longer. Go and answer it, Frank told her. She made no reply. Go on, he told her, turning his foul head in her direction, his keen eyes and bright in the surrounding corruption. The bell rang a third time. Your caller is very insistent, he said, trying persuasion where demands had failed. I really think you should answer the door. She backed away from him, and he turned his attentions back to the body on the floor. Again, the bell. It was better to answer it, perhaps. She was already out of the room, trying not to hear the sounds Frank was making. Better to open the door to the day. It would be a man selling insurance, most likely, or a Jehovah's Witness with news of salvation. Yes, she wouldn't mind hearing that. The bell rang again. Coming, she said, hurrying now for fear he'd leave. She had welcome on her face when she opened the door. It died immediately. Kirsty, I was just about to give up on you. I was asleep. Oh. Kirsty looked at the apparition that had opened the door to her. From Rory's description, she'd expected a washed-out creature. What she saw was quite the reverse. Julia's face was flushed. Strands of sweat darkened, hair glued to her brow. She did not look like a woman who had just risen from sleep. A bed, perhaps, but not sleep. I just called by, Kirsty said. For a chat. Julia made a half shrug. Well, it's not convenient just at the moment, she said. I see. Maybe we could speak later in the week. Kirsty's gaze drifted past Julia to the coat stand in the hall. A man's gabardine hung from one of the pegs, still damp. Is Rory in? She ventured. No, Julia said. Of course not, he's at work. Her face hardened. Is that what you came round for? She said. To see Rory? No, You don't have to ask my permission, you know. He's a grown man. You two can do what the fuck you like. Kirsty didn't try to debate the point. The vault face left her dizzied. Go home, Julia said. I don't want to talk to you. She slammed the door. Excuse me. Itchy nose. Kirsty stood on the step for half a minute, shaking. She had little doubt of what was going on. The dripping raincoat, Julia's agitation, her flushed face, her sudden anger. She had a lover in the house. Poor Rory had misread all the signs. She deserted the doorstep and started down the path to the street. A crowd of thoughts jostled for her attention. At last one came clear of the pack. How would she tell Rory? His heart would break. She had no doubt of that. And she, the luckless tale teller, she would be tainted with the news, wouldn't she? She felt tears close. They didn't come. However, another sensation, more insistent, overtook as she stepped onto the pavement from the path. She was being watched. She could feel the look at the back of her head. Was it Julia? Somehow she thought not. The lover then? Yes, the lover. Safely out of the shadow of the house, she succumbed to the urge to turn and look. In the damp room, Frank stared through the hole he had made in the blind. The visitor whose face he vaguely recognised was staring up at the house. At this very window, indeed. Confident that she could see nothing of him, he stared back. He had certainly set his eyes on more voluptuous creatures, but something about her lack of glamour engaged him. Such women were in his experience often more entertaining company than beauties like Julia. They could be flattered or bullied into acts the beauties would never countenance and be grateful for the attention. Perhaps she would come back, this woman. He hoped she would. Kirsty scanned the facade of the house, but it was blank. The windows were either empty or curtained, yet the feeling of being watched persisted. Instead, it was so strong she turned away in embarrassment. The rain started again as she walked along Ludovico Street, and she welcomed it. It cooled her blushes and gave cover to tears that would be postponed no longer. Julia had gone back upstairs trembling and found White Tie at the door, or rather, his head. This time, out of an excess of greed or malice, Frank had dismembered the corpse. Pieces of bone and dried meat lay scattered about the room. There was no sign of the gourmet himself. She turned back toward the door, and he was there, blocking her path. Mere minutes had passed since she'd seen him bending to drain energy from the dead man. In that brief time he had changed out of all recognition. Where there had been withered cartilage, there was now ripening muscle. The map of his arteries and veins was being drawn anew. They pulsed with stolen life. There was even a sprouting of hair, somewhat premature perhaps given his absence of skin, on the raw ball of his head. None of this sweetened his appearance a jot. Indeed, in many ways it worsened it. Previously there had been scarcely anything recognisable about him, but now there were scraps of humanity everywhere, throwing into yet greater relief the catastrophic nature of his wounding. There was worse to come. He spoke, and when he spoke it was with a voice that was undisputably Frank's. The broken syllables had gone. "I feel pain," he said. His browless, half-lidded eyes were watching her every response. She tried to conceal the queasiness she felt, but knew the disguise was inadequate. "My nerves are working again," he was telling her, "and they hurt." "What can I do about it?" she asked him. Maybe some bandages." "Bandages? Help me bind myself together." "If that's what you want." "But I need more than that, Julia. I need another body." "Another?" she said. Was there no end to this? "What's to lose?" he replied, moving closer to her. At his sudden proximity she became very anxious. Reading the fear in her face, he stopped his advance. "I'll be whole soon," he promised her. "When I am." "I'd better clear up," she said, averting her gaze from him. "When I am, sweet Julia." "Rory will be home soon." "Rory!" He spat the name out. "My darling brother, how in God's name did you come to marry such a dullard?" She felt a spasm of anger toward Frank. "I loved him," she said. Then, after a moment's pondering, corrected herself. "I thought I loved him." His laugh only made his dreadful nakedness more apparent. "How can you have believed that?" he said. "He's a slug. Always was, always will be. Never had any sense of adventure. Unlike you. Unlike me. She looked down at the floor. A dead man's hand lay between them. For an instant, she was almost overwhelmed by self-revulsion. All that she had done and dreamed of doing in the last few days rose up in front of her. A parade of seductions that had ended in death. All for this death that she had hoped so fervently would end in seduction. She was damned as he, she thought. No fouler ambition could nest in his head than presently cooed and fluttered in hers. Well, it was done. Heal me, he whispered to her. The harshness had gone from his voice. He spoke like a lover. Heal me, please. I will, she said. I promise you I will. And then we'll be together. She frowned. What about Rory? We're brothers under the skin, Frank said. I'll make him see the wisdom of this, the miracle of it. You don't belong to him, Julia. Not anymore. No, she said. It was true. We belong together. We belong to each other. That's what you want, isn't it? It's what I want. You know, I think if I'd had you, I wouldn't have despaired, he said to her. Wouldn't have given away my body and soul so cheaply. Cheaply? For pleasure. For mere sensuality. In you. Here he moved towards her again. This time his words held her. She didn't retreat. In you, I might have discovered some reason to live. I'm here, she said. Without thinking, she reached across and touched him. The body was hot and damp. His pulse seemed to be everywhere, in every tender bud of nerve, in each burgeoning sinew. The contact excited her. It was as if, until this moment, she had never quite believed him to be real. Now it was uncontestable. She had made this man, or remade him. Used her wit and her cunning to give him substance. The thrill she felt touching this too vulnerable body was the thrill of ownership. This is the most dangerous time, he told her. Before now I could hide myself. I was practically nothing at all. But not anymore. No, I've thought of that. We must be done with it quickly. I must be strong and whole, at whatever cost. You agree? Of course. After that, there'll be an end to the waiting, Julia. The pulse in him seemed to quicken at the thought. Then he was kneeling in front of her. His unfinished hands were at her hips. Then his mouth. Forsaking the dregs of her distaste, she put her hand upon his head and felt the hair silken, like a baby's, and the shell of his skull beneath. He had learned nothing of delicacy since last he'd held her. But despair had taught her the fine art of squeezing blood from stones. With time, she would have love from this hateful thing, or know the reason why. Wow. Time for a sippy. Let's have a quick recap then. So, another person dead. White tie. Hey, Author Thee, how's it going, dude? I do hope you are well. So, White Tie is dead. Kirsty seems to believe that Julia is having an affair. Frank is nearly complete in terms of his resurrection. How many has been killed? Only 2 so far, but they are both large gentlemen. We have blue coat and white tie so far. We have heard that the Cenobites are drawing closer. They are just beyond the veil, or beyond the wall, essentially. I wonder when or if they'll come. Shall we carry on? Chapter 8. Excusez-moi. There was thunder that night, storm without rain, which made the air smell of steel. Kirsty had never slept well, even as a child, though her mother had known lullabies to pacify nations. The girl had never found slumber easy. It wasn't that she had bad dreams, or at least none that lingered until morning. It was that sleep itself, the act of closing the eyes and relinquishing control of her consciousness, was something she was temperamentally unsuited to. Tonight, with the thunder so loud and the lightning so bright, she was happy. She had an excuse to forsake her tangled bed and drink tea and watch the spectacle from her window. It gave her time to think, as well time to turn over the problem that had vexed her since leaving the house on Ludovico Street. But she was still no nearer an answer. One particular doubt nagged. Suppose she was wrong about what she'd seen. Suppose she'd misconstrued the evidence and Julia had a perfectly good explanation. She would lose Rory at a stroke. And yet, how could she remain silent? She couldn't bear to think of the woman laughing behind his back, exploiting his gentility, his naivety. The thought made her blood boil. The only other option was to wait and watch, to see if she could gain some incontrovertible evidence. If her worst suppositions were then confirmed, she would have no choice but to tell Rory all she'd seen. Yes, that was the answer. Wait and watch. Watch and wait. The thunder rolled around for long hours, denying her sleep until nearly 4 in the morning. When finally she did sleep, it was the slumber of a watcher and waiter, light and full of sighs. The storm made a ghost train of the house. Julia sat downstairs and counted the beats between the flash and the fury that came on its heels. She had never liked thunder. She, a murderess. She, a consorter with the living dead. It was another paradox to add to the 1,000 she'd found at work in herself of late. She thought more than once of going upstairs and taking some comfort with the prodigy, but knew it would be unwise. Rory might return any moment from his office party. He would be drunk, on past experience, and full of unwelcome fondness. The storm crept closer. She put on the television to block out the din, which it scarcely did. At 11, Rory came home, wreathed in smiles. He had good news. In the middle of the party, his supervisor had taken him aside, commended him for his excellent work and spoken of great things for the future. Julia listened to his retelling of the exchange, hoping that his inebriation would blind him to her indifference. At last, his news told, he threw off his jacket and sat down on the sofa beside her. "Poor you," he said. "You don't like the thunder." "I'm fine," she said. "Are you sure?" "Yes, fine." He leaned across to her and nuzzled her ear. "You're sweaty," she said, matter-of-factly. He didn't cease his overtures, however, unwilling to lower his baton now that he'd begun. "Please, Rory," she said. "I don't want this." Why not? What did I do? Nothing, she said, pretending some interest in the television. You're fine. Is that right? He said. You're fine, I'm fine, everybody's fucking fine. She stared at the flickering screen. The late evening news had just begun, the usual cup of sorrows full to brimming. Rory talked on, drowning out the newscaster's voice with his diatribe. I hope that was the right word. She didn't much mind. What did the world have to tell her? Little enough, whereas she had news for the world that it would need real to hear. About the condition of the damned, about love lost, and then found, about what despair and desire have in common. Please, Julia, Rory was saying, just speak to me. The pleas demanded her attention. He looked, she thought, like the boy in the photographs, his body hirsute and bloated. His clothes, those of an adult, but still in essence a boy. With his bewildered gaze and sulky mouth, she remembered Frank's question. How could you ever have married such a dullard? Thinking of it, a sour smile creased her lips. He looked at her, his puzzlement deepening. What's so funny, damn you? Nothing. He shook his head, dull anger replacing the sulk. A peal of thunder followed the lightning, with barely a beat intervening. As it came, there was a noise from the floor above. She turned her attention back to the television to divert Rory's interest, but it was a vain attempt. He'd heard the sound. The fuck was that? Thunder. He stood up. No, he said. Something else. He was already at the door. A dozen options raced through her head, none of them practical. He wrestled drunkenly with the door handle. Maybe I left a window open, she said, and got up. I'll go and see. I can do it, he replied. I'm not totally inept. Nobody said, she began, but he wasn't listening. As he stepped out into the hallway, the lightning came with the thunder loud and bright. As she went in pursuit of him, another flash came fast upon the first, accompanied by a bowel-rocking crash. Rory was already halfway up the stairs. It was nothing, she shouted after him. He made no reply but climbed onto the top of the stairs. She followed. Don't, she said to him, in a lull between one peal and the next. He heard her this time, or rather, chose to listen. When she reached the top of the stairs, he was waiting. Something wrong, he said. She hid her trepidation behind a shrug. You're being silly, she replied softly. Am I? It was just the thunder. His face, lit from the hall below, suddenly softened. Why do you treat me like shit? He asked her. You're just tired, she told him. Why though? He persisted, childlike. What have I ever done to you? It's all right, she said. Really, Rory, everything's all right. The same hypnotic banalities over and over. Again the thunder, and beneath the din, another sound. She cursed Frank's indiscretion. Rory turned and looked along the darkened landing. Hear that? He said. No. His limbs dogged by drink, he moved away from her. She watched him recede into shadow. Lightning spilling through the open bedroom door. Flash lit him, then darkness again. He was walking toward the damp room. Toward Frank. Wait, she said, and went after him. He didn't halt, but covered the few yards to the door. As she reached him, his hand was closing on the handle. Inspired by panic, she reached and touched his cheek. I'm afraid, she said. He looked around at her woozily. What of? He asked her. She moved her hand to his lips, letting him taste the fear on her fingers. The storm, she said. She could see the wetness of his eyes in the gloom, little more. Was he swallowing the hook or spitting it out? Then, poor baby, he said. Swallowed, she elated, and reaching down she put her hand over his and drew it from the door. If Frank so much as breathed now, all was lost. Poor baby, he said again, and wrapped an embrace around her. His balance was not too good. He was a lead weight in her arms. Come on, she said, coaxing him away from the door. He went with her for a couple of stumbling paces and then lost his equilibrium. She let go of him and reached out to the wall for support. The lightning came again, and by it she saw that his eyes had found her and glittered. I love you, he said, stepping across the hallway to where she stood. He pressed against her so heavily there was no resisting. His head went to the crook of her neck, muttering sweet talk into her skin. Now he was kissing her. She wanted to throw him off. More, she wanted to take him by his clammy hand and show him the death-defying monster he had been so close to stumbling across. But Frank wasn't ready for that confrontation. Not yet. All she could do was endure Rory's caresses and hope that exhaustion claimed him quickly. Why don't we go downstairs, she suggested. He muttered something into her neck and didn't move. His left hand was on her breast, the other clasped around her waist. She let him work his fingers beneath her blouse. To resist at this juncture would only inflame him afresh. I need you, he said, raising his mouth to her ear. Once, half a lifetime ago, her heart had seemed to skip at such a profession. Now she knew better. Her heart was no acrobat. There was no tingle in the coils of her abdomen, only the steady workings of her body. Breath drawn, blood circulated. Food pulped and purged. Thinking of her anatomy thus, untainted by romanticism, as a collection of natural imperatives housed in muscle and bone, she found it easier to let him strip her blouse and put his face to her breasts. Her nerve endings dutifully responded to his tongue, but again it was merely an anatomy lesson. An anemone. She stood back in the dome of her skull and was unmoved. He was unbuttoning himself now. She caught sight of the boastful plum as he stroked it against her thigh. Now he opened her legs and pulled her underwear down just far enough to give him access. She made no objection, nor even a sound as he made his entrance. His own din began almost immediately. Feeble claims to love and lust hopefully tangled together. She half listened and let him work at his play, his face buried in her hair. Closing her eyes, she tried to picture better times, but the lightning spoiled her dreaming. As sound followed light, she opened her eyes again to see that the door of the damp room had been opened 2 or 3 inches. In the narrow gap between door and frame, she could just make out a glistening figure, watching them. She could not see Frank's eyes, but she felt them sharpened beyond pricking by envy and rage. Nor did she look away, but stared on at the shadow while Rory's moans increased. And at the end, one moment became another, and she was lying on the bed with her wedding dress crushed beneath her, while a black and scarlet beast crept up between her legs to give her a sample of its love. Poor baby was the last thing Rory said as sleep overcame him. He lay on the bed, still dressed. She made no attempt to strip him. When his snores were even, she left him to it and went back to the room. Frank was standing beside the window, watching the storm move to the southeast. He had torn the blind away. Lamplight washed the walls. He heard you, she said. I had to see the storm, he replied simply. I needed it. He almost found you, damn it. Frank shook his head. There's no such thing as almost, he said, staring out of the window. Then, after a pause, I want to be out there. I want to have it all again. I know. No, you don't, he told her. You've no conception of the hunger I've got on me. Tomorrow, she said. I'll get another body tomorrow. Yes, you do that. And I want some other stuff. A radio, for one. I want to know what's going on out there. And food. Proper food. Fresh bread. Whatever you need. And ginger, the preserved kind, you know, in syrup. I know. He glanced round at her briefly, but he wasn't seeing her. There was too much world to be reacquainted with tonight. I didn't realise it was autumn, he said, and went back to watching the storm. Oh dear. Oh dear, oh dear. Not much to recap there. Rory, coming back home drunk. Frank, all but returning more or less back human. Shall we carry on with chapter 9? Big sippy. Yeah. You've been enjoying this very much. I do thank you, Samus. I don't know where I would have been inspired to do such a thing. Okay, last chapter, guys. And ghouls. Guys and ghouls, ladies and germs. I say last chapter, it's just the last chapter of the night. Chapter 9. Is what it's called. The first thing Kirsty noticed when she came round the corner of Ludovico Street the following day was that the blind had gone from the upstairs window. Sheets of newspaper had been taped against the glass in its place. She found herself a vantage point in the shelter of a holly hedge, from which she hoped she could watch the house but remain unseen. Then she settled down for her vigil. It was not quickly rewarded. 2 hours and more went by before she saw Julia leave the house. Another hour and a quarter before she returned, by which time Kirsty's feet were numb with cold. Julia had not returned alone. The man she was with was not known to Kirsty, nor indeed did he look to be a likely member of Julia's circle. From the distance, he appeared to be in middle age, stocky, balding. When he followed Julia into the house, he gave a nervous backward glance, as if fearful of voyeurs. She waited in her hiding place for a further quarter of an hour, not certain of what to do next. Did she linger here until the man emerged and challenge him? Or did she go to the house and try to talk her way inside? Neither option was particularly attractive. She decided not to decide. Instead, she would get closer to the house and see what inspiration the moment brought. The answer was very little. As she made her way up the path, her feet itched to turn and carry her away. Indeed, she was within an ace of doing just that when she heard a shout from within. The man's name was Sykes, Stanley Sykes. Nor was that all he'd told Julia on the way back from the bar. She knew his wife's name, Maudie, and occupation, assistant chiropodist. She'd had pictures of the children, Rebecca and Ethan, provided for her to coo over. The man seemed to be defying her to continue the seduction. She merely smiled and told him he was a lucky man. But once in the house, things had begun to go awry. Halfway up the stairs, friend Sykes had suddenly announced that what they were doing was wrong, that God saw them and knew their hearts and found them wanting. She had done her best to calm him, but he was not to be won back from the Lord. Instead, he lost his temper and flailed at her. He might have done worse in his righteous wrath, but for the voice that had called him from the landing. He'd stopped hitting her instantly and became so pale it was as if he believed God himself was doing the calling. Then Frank had appeared at the top of the stairs in all his glory. Sykes had loosed a cry and tried to run, but Julia was quick. She had her hand on him long enough for Frank to descend the few stairs and make a permanent arrest. She had not realised until she heard the creak and snap of bone as Frank took hold of his prey how strong he had become of late. Stronger, surely, than a natural man. At Frank's touch, Sykes had shouted again, To silence him, Frank wrenched off his jaw. The second shout that Kirsty had heard had ended abruptly, but she read enough panic in the din to have her at the door and on the verge of knocking. Only then did she think better of it. Instead, she slipped down the side of the house, doubting with every step the wisdom of this, but equally certain that a frontal assault would get her nowhere. The gate that offered access to the back garden was lacking a bolt. She slipped through, her ears alive to every sound, especially that of her own feet. From the house, nothing, not so much as a moan. Leaving the gate open in case she should need a quick retreat, she hurried back to the back door. It was unlocked. This time, she let doubt slow her step. Maybe she should go and call Rory, bring him to the house. But by that time, whatever was happening inside would be over, and she knew damn well that, unless Julia was caught red-handed, she would slide from under any accusation. No, this was the only way. She stepped inside. The house remained completely quiet. There was not even a footfall to help her locate the actors she'd come to view. She moved to the kitchen floor. From there to the dining room, her stomach twitched. Her throat was suddenly so dry she could barely swallow. From dining room to lounge, and thence into the hallway, still nothing. No whisper or sigh. Julia and her companion could only be upstairs, which suggested that she had been wrong, thinking she heard fear in the shouts. Perhaps it was pleasure she had heard, an orgasmic whoop instead of the terror she'd mistaken it for. It was an easy mistake to make. The front door was on her right, mere yards away. She could still slip out and away. The coward in her tempted, and no one be any the wiser. A fierce curiosity had seized her, a desire to know, to see the mysteries the house held, and be done with them. As she climbed the stairs, the curiosity mounted to a kind of exhilaration. She reached the top and began to make her way along the landing. The thought occurred now that the birds had flown, that while she had been creeping... excuse me. Do apologise. Just realised what's... good. Apologies. The coward in her tempted, and no one but be any the wiser. But a fierce curiosity had seized her, a desire to know, to see the mysteries the house held, and be done with them. As she climbed the stairs, the curiosity mounted to a kind of exhilaration. She reached the top and began to make her way along the landing. The thought occurred now that the birds had flown, that while she had been creeping through from the back of the house, they had left via the front. The first door on the left was the bedroom. If they were mating anywhere, Julia and her paramour, it would surely be here. But no. The door stood ajar. She peered in. The bedspread was uncreased. Then, a misshapen cry. So near, so loud, her heart missed its rhythm. She ducked out of the bedroom to see a figure lurch from one of the rooms farther along the landing. It took her a moment to recognise the fretful man who had arrived with Julia, and only then by his clothes. The rest was changed, horribly changed. A wasting disease had seized him in the minutes she'd seen him on the step, shrivelling the flesh on the bone. Seeing Kirsty, he threw himself toward her, seeking what fragile protection she could offer. He had got no more than a pace from the door, however, when a form spilled into sight behind him. It too seemed diseased, its body bandaged from head to foot, the bindings stained by issues of blood and pus. There was nothing in its speed. However, the ferocity of its subsequent attack has suggested sickness. Quite the reverse, it reached for the fleeing man and took hold of him by the neck. Kirsty let out a cry as the captor drew its prey back into its embrace. The victim made what little complaint his dislocated face was capable of. Then the antagonist tightened its embrace. The body trembled and twitched, its legs buckled. Blood spurted from eyes and nose and mouth. Spots of it filled the air like hot hail, breaking against her brow. The sensation snapped her from her inertia. This was no time to wait and watch. She ran. The monster made no pursuit. She reached the top of the stairs without being overtaken, but as her foot descended, it addressed her. Its voice was familiar. "There you are," it said. It spoke with melting tones as if it knew her. She stopped. "Kirsty," it said. "Wait a while." Her head told her to run. Her gut defied the wisdom, however. It wanted to remember whose voice this was, speaking from the building. She could still make good her escape, she reasoned. She had an 8-yard start. She looked round at the figure. The body in its arms had curled up. Fetally, legs against chest, the beast dropped it. "You killed him," she said. The thing nodded. It had no apologies to make, apparently, to either victim or witness. "We'll mourn him later," it told her, and took a step towards her. "Where's Julia?" Kirsty demanded. "Don't you fret. All's well," the voice said. She was close to remembering who it was. As she puzzled, it took another step, one hand upon the wall, as if its balance was still uncertain. "I saw you," it went on. "I think you saw me, at the window." The mystification increased. Had this thing been in the house that long? If so, surely Rory must. And then she knew the voice. "Yes, you do remember. I can see you remember." It was Rory's voice, or rather, a close approximation of it. More guttural, more self-regarding, but the resemblance was uncanny enough to keep her rooted to the spot while the beast shambled within snatching distance of her. At the last, she recanted her fascination and turned to flee. But the cause was already lost. She heard it step a pace behind her, then felt its fingers at her neck. The cry came to her lips, but it was barely mounted before the thing had corrugated palm across her face, concealing both the shout and the breath it came upon. It plucked her up and took her back the way she'd came. In vain she struggled against its hold, the small wounds her fingers made upon its body tearing at the bandages and digging into the rawness beneath left it entirely unmoved, it seemed. For a horrid moment her heels snagged the corpse on the floor, then she was being hauled into the room from which the living and the dead had emerged. It smelled of soured milk and fresh meat. When she was flung down, the floorboards beneath her were wet and warm. Her belly wanted to turn inside out. She didn't fight the instinct, but retched up all that her stomach held. In the confusion of present discomfort and anticipated terror, she was not certain of what happened next. Did she glimpse somebody else? Julia, perhaps, on the landing, as the door was slammed? Or was it Shadow? One way or another, it was too late for appeals. She was alone with the nightmare. Wiping the bile from her mouth, she got to her feet. Daylight pierced the newspaper at the window, here and there, dappling the room like sunlight through branches. And through this pastoral, the thing came sniffing her. "Come to Daddy," it said. In her 26 years, she had never heard an easier invitation to refuse. "Don't touch me," she told it. It cocked its head a little, as if charmed by the show of propriety. Then it closed in on her, all pus and laughter, and God help her desire. She backed a few desperate inches into the corner until there was nowhere else for her to go. "Don't you remember me?" it said. She shook her head. "Frank," came the reply. "This is Brother Frank." She had met Frank only once, at Alexandra Road. He'd come visiting one afternoon just before the wedding. More she couldn't recall, except that she'd hated him on sight. "Leave me alone," she said as it reached for her. There was a vile finesse in the way his stained fingers touched her breast. "Don't," she shrieked, "or so help me." "What?" said Rory's voice. "What will you do?" Nothing was the answer, of course. She was helpless, as only she had ever been in dreams, those dreams of pursuit and assault that her psyche had always staged on a ghetto street in some eternal night. Never, not even in her most witless fantasies, had she anticipated that the arena would be a room she had walked past a dozen times, in a house where she had been happy, while outside the day went on as ever, grey on grey. In a futile gesture of disgust, she pushed the investigating hand away. "Don't be cruel," the thing said, and his fingers found her skin again, as unchewable as October wasps. "What's to be frightened of?" Outside, she began, thinking of the horror on the landing. "A man has to eat," Frank said. "Surely you can forgive me that?" Why did she even feel his touch, she wondered. Why didn't her nerves share her disgust and die beneath his caress? "This isn't happening," she told herself aloud. But the beast only laughed. "I used to tell myself that," he said. "Day in, day out. Used to try and dream the agonies away, but you can't. Take it from me, you can't. They have to be endured." She knew he was telling the truth, the kind of unsavoury truth that only monsters were at liberty to tell. He had no need to flatter or cajole. He had no philosophy to debate or sermon to deliver. His awful nakedness was a kind of sophistication, past the lies of faith and into purer realms. She knew, too, that she would not endure, that when her pleadings faltered and Frank claimed her for whatever vileness he had in mind, she would lose such a scream that she would shatter. Her very sanity was at stake here. She had no choice but to fight back, and quickly. Before Frank had a chance to press his suit any harder, her hands went up to his face, fingers gouging at his eye holes and mouth. The flesh beneath the bandage had the consistency of jelly. It came away in globs, and with it, a wet heat. The beast shouted out, his grip on her relaxing, seizing the moment she threw herself out from under him, the momentum carrying her against the wall with enough force to badly wind her. Again, Frank roared. She didn't waste time enjoying his discomfort, but slid along the wall, not trusting her legs sufficiently to move into open territory toward the door. As she advanced, her feet sent an unlidded jar of preserved ginger rolling across the room, spilling syrup and fruit alike. Frank turned toward her, the bandaging about his face hanging in scarlet loops where she'd torn it away. In several places the bone was exposed. Even now he ran his hands over the wounds, roars of horror coming as he sought to measure the degree of his maiming. Had she blinded him? She wasn't sure. Even if she had, it was only a matter of time before he located her in this small room. And when he did, his rage would know no bounds. She had to reach the door before he reorientated himself. Faint hope. She hadn't a moment to take a step before he dropped his hands from his face and scanned the room. He saw her, no doubt of that. A beat later he was bearing down upon her with renewed violence. At her feet lay a litter of domestic items. The heaviest item amongst them was a plain box. She reached down and picked it up. As she stood upright, he was upon her. She loosed a cry of defiance and swung the box-bearing fist at his head. It connected heavily. Bone splintered. The beast tottered backward, and she launched herself toward the door. But before she reached it, the shadow swamped her once more, and she was flung backward across the room. It came in a raging pursuit. This time, he had no intention beyond the murderous. His lashes were intended to kill. That they did not was testament less to her speed than to the impression of his fury. Nevertheless, one out of every 3 blows caught her. Gashes opened up in her face and upper chest. It was all she could do to prevent herself from fainting. As she sank beneath his assault, again she remembered the weapon she'd found. The box was still in her hand. She raised it to deliver another blow, but as Frank's eyes came to rest on the box, his assault abruptly ceased. There was a panting respite, in which Kirsty had a chance to wonder if death might not be easier than further flight. Then Frank raised his arm toward her, unfurled his fist, and said, "Give it to me." He wanted his keepsake, it seemed, but she had no intention of relinquishing her only weapon. "No," she said. He made the demand a second time, and there was a distinct anxiety in his tone. It seemed the box was too precious for him to risk taking it by force. "One last time," he said to her, "then I'll kill you. Give me the box." She weighed the chances. What had she left to lose? "Say please," she said. He regarded her quizzically, a soft growl in his throat, then polite as a calculating child, he said, "Please." The word was her cue. She threw the box at the window with all the strength her trembling arm possessed. It sailed past Frank's head, shattering the glass, and disappeared from sight. "No!" he shrieked, and was at the window in a heartbeat. "No, no, no!" She raced to the door, her legs threatening to fail her. Pastry, thank you very much for the host. Cheers. She raced to the door, her legs threatening to fail with every step. Then she was out onto the landing. The stairs almost defeated her, but she clung to the banister like a geriatric and made it to the hallway without failing. Above there was further din. He was calling after her again, but this time she would not be caught. She fled along the hallway to the front door and flung it open. The day had brightened since she'd first entered the house, a defiant burst of sunlight before evening fell. Squinting against the glare, she started down the pathway. There was glass underfoot, and amongst the shards, a weapon. She picked it up, a souvenir of her defiance, and ran. As she reached the street proper, words began to come. A hopeless babble, fragments of things seen and felt. But Ludovico Street was deserted, so she began to run, and kept running until she had put a good distance between her and the bandaged beast. The heckin' heart. Eventually, wandering on some streets she didn't recognize, somebody asked her if she needed help. The little kindness defeated her. The effort of making some coherent reply to the inquiry was too much, and her exhausted mind lost hold on the light. Wow. Wow. That is the end of chapter 9. Not entirely sure how many chapters there are. but we'll see next time if we can finish the stream. The end of the book. I've decided that we'll probably do more of these, and I'll put some books into the Discord, the titles of some books into the Discord for those wanting to have a hand in what I read next. There'll be things that I choose, but that you will be able to choose between. Thank you very much, Samus and Slandy. Thank you for the pleasantries. I appreciate them. Is this being uploaded somewhere? It is. It's on YouTube. Hey, Darkholder! How's it going, dude? Thank you for dropping by. I appreciate. Yes, it's been quite lovely indeed. So a recap on chapter 9, just in case. Kirsty has entered the house and found that Julia hasn't been having an affair, and yet someone who she feels, who she knew, was there instead, Rory. What turns out was actually his dead brother Frank, who seems to have come back from the dead somewhat. And it seemed like he has his intentions of being quite naughty to her, but she manages to escape using what we do believe to be the Lamanshard box, the puzzle box that let him return from the dead. She currently holds that within her grasp as she threw it toward the window, and as he tried to grab it out of the air, failed. Oh dear, I dropped my pen. Ultimately failed. She managed to escape. So, that was the Hellbound Heart, chapters 5 to 10. The beginning of 10, sorry. I do believe that we're going to go and do a thing and do the raid. The awesome raid. So, let's have a look who we have on. Aha! Now, here is an interesting one. I've not managed to raid this person yet. So, I would very much... Oh my lord, that was super loud. Holy shit, dude. I would like you all to accompany me on raiding the Talking Flower. So please, like I say, join me in raiding said person. And I just want to say as well, thank you ever so much for everyone, just taking the time to come, read, chill, all that. I have been thoroughly enjoying these. They've been great. Thank you to Crow and Kaz. Thank you to Samus and Pastry for the hosts as well. And again, thank you all for being awesome. Let's go and say hello to the Talking Flower. Give them the support that they need. They are on 38 followers, so every little helps. They are playing Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD. I'll see you on Sunday, where we start playing a different game. Take care, everyone. Have yourselves a wonderful day, evening, or night.